Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to ancient Rome, back to marble corridors, flickering torches, and a handful of very stressed senators who, frankly, needed a nap more than a conspiracy. So, dim your lights, settle your pillows, and let your breathing soften. This is one of history's most famous betrayals, told slowly, gently, and with just enough dry humor to keep your mind floating but not racing. If you're comfortable, go ahead and hit the like button or don't. Caesar won't mind either way. And if you feel your eyes getting heavy as we wander through Rome's politics, that's perfectly fine. We're in no rush. Tonight, we're drifting through the final days of Julius Caesar. And yes, naturally, it ends badly for him. Let's ease into it. A calm walk toward a not-so-calm murder. The story begins with Julius Caesar, general, statesman, and part-time overachiever who had spent most of his adult life doing whatever he pleased. Rome adored him, or hated him, or both, depending on whether you asked a loyal soldier or a senator who felt personally overshadowed by Caesar's cheekbones and ambition. By 44 BCE, Caesar had done the unthinkable. He had defeated Pompey, taken full control of Rome, and accepted the title of dictator for life. Now, the Romans had many traditions, but one man ruling forever was not a comforting one. They preferred a system where power changed hands, frequently usually with shouting, bribery, or an occasional street riot to keep things interesting. But Caesar, well, he was not exactly subtle. He took his triumphs, he displayed his statues, he let people call him imperial, and he sat on a special golden chair in the Senate, which, to the senators, probably felt like he was already planning the commemorative mugs and office signage for his new monarchy. Still, Caesar himself seemed too relaxed for a man surrounded by people whispering behind pillars. He had begun granting pardons, showing mercy to his former enemies. A very noble thing, of course, and naturally, it made those enemies incredibly nervous. Nothing alarms a Roman aristocrat more than someone being nice to him for no apparent reason. So resentment simmered, quietly, softly, the way a candle burns down before a breeze finishes it. The senators who really needed a hobby now. Let's drift over to a few of Caesar's closest critics. These were men who believed deeply in the Republic. They also believed deeply in their personal influence and comfort. Julius Caesar, it must be said, had an unfortunate habit of making other important men feel like decorative furniture. At the center of the growing plot were Gaius, Cassius Longinus, and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was the type of Roman who could start an argument with a sleeping cat, sharp, ambitious, and resentful. He had once fought against Caesar, lost, and then been pardoned, for which he remained eternally ungrateful. Caesar had a habit of forgiving people in a way that felt like handing out free samples of humiliation. Brutus, on the other hand, was earnest, philosophical, and constantly burdened by his family legacy, which included an ancestor who famously drove out Rome's last king. This meant whenever Caesar so much as wore a shiny robe, someone would whisper to Brutus, "Hey, doesn't that feel monarchical?" And Brutus, already the type to overthink absolutely everything, absorbed it all in a quiet, sleepless way. The conspirators eventually formed a group of about 60 men, an impressive number, as murder usually requires far fewer participants. But Roman senators had a gift for making simple situations unnecessarily complicated. So they whispered, plotted, rewrote their plans, tore up the new plans, argued about locations, and probably lost several nights of sleep imagining Caesar glaring at them through his eyebrows. The problem with murdering a man who never stops working, Caesar had a schedule that could exhaust a modern CEO. He barely rested. He attended meetings. He held banquets. He planned campaigns. He issued decrees. And he was in the middle of preparing to leave Rome to fight a new war in Parthia, which meant, for the conspirators, time was running out. They needed Caesar in Rome, ideally in a location where he was unguarded, preferably inside a building where they could surround him without looking suspicious. And ideally, they wanted it all to take place before he left the city and became much harder to stab. The Senate House provided the perfect setting, or, well, perfect if you ignored the fact that Caesar was a seasoned general who had survived multiple wars, rebellions, and ambushes. But optimism is a powerful drug, and the senators were fully committed. A series of unhelpful signs and omens. As the fateful morning of March 15th approached the Ides of March, many strange things reportedly happened. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his statue bleeding. She begged him not to go out, and Caesar, being Caesar, responded in the reasonable manner of a man who had conquered half the known world. He rolled his eyes and prepared to leave. A soothsayer famously warned him, "Beware the Ides of March." But Caesar had never taken fortune-tellers seriously. He treated them the way modern people treat the low battery warning, but easy to ignore. Even one of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, arrived to escort Caesar and gently remind him that skipping a Senate meeting might look bad politically. Caesar, naturally, didn't want to look weak, so he stepped outside, and that single decision made him the most famous cautionary tale in political history. Approaching the Senate slowly, as Caesar traveled toward the Senate house, the conspirators walked with him, trying to maintain calm expressions. This was difficult, because most of them had the acting skills of a broken marble bust. One man tried to hand Caesar a scroll containing information about the plot. Caesar waved him away, because he was of course too busy, so the warning was never read. A small tragedy wrapped inside a larger one. The assassination slow enough to drift through inside the Senate house. The conspirators closed in around Caesar. They pretended to greet him warmly. Some bowed, some thanked him. A few probably tried to avoid eye contact, which in hindsight might have been a clue. The plan was to present a petition. They wanted Caesar to restore the political rights of a banished senator, something they knew he would refuse. This would give them an excuse to crowd closer. Julius Caesar stepped forward and pulled at Caesar's toga. Caesar brushed his hand off. Naturally, this annoyed Caesar, who did not enjoy being handled like a display carpet. And then came the first stab. Casca plunged his dagger forward, but in the chaotic, uncoordinated way of a man who had never practiced stabbing someone of Caesar's stature. Caesar grabbed his arm. They struggled. Casca reportedly shouted for help, an interesting choice of words for someone committing murder. Then the others joined in. One by one, daggers flashed. They were frantic, sloppy, disorganized, not the elegant, decisive rebellion they had imagined. Caesar, realizing the situation, fought back at first, but as more blows landed, he began to collapse. Blood spread across the marble floor. A quiet, terrible moment. The Senate house grew still, except for the senator's uneven breathing, and then came Brutus. Caesar saw him, and in that moment, the fight drained out of him. Whether he spoke those famous words, "You too, child," we'll never truly know, but the meaning remains. Betrayal always hits hardest when it comes from the person you trusted most. Caesar pulled his toga over his face. He sank to the ground, and the blows continued until there was nothing left to strike. When it was done, he had suffered 23 stab wounds. Only one was fatal. The rest were enthusiastic extras. The conspirators stepped back, coated in the evidence of their own confusion and regret, and Rome held its breath. The quiet aftermath no one planned for. You might expect the senators to celebrate, to declare liberty restored, to give speeches about saving the republic, but instead, they fled. All of them. The moment Caesar's body hit the ground, the conspirators realized that killing him was the easy part, explaining it to his supporters, significantly harder. The Senate chamber emptied in seconds, leaving Caesar lying alone on the marble. A man who had reshaped the world, now silent. Servants eventually came. They lifted him gently. They carried him home, and Rome entered a long, uneasy twilight. Because, naturally, killing Julius Caesar did not restore harmony. It plunged the Republic into even worse chaos, into civil wars, into shifting loyalties, and ultimately, into exactly what the conspirators feared most, the rise of an emperor. But that we'll drift into later. For now, breathe softly, rest your thoughts. Let the image of ancient Rome fade into a gentle blur. The Ides of March have passed, and Caesar has fallen. Let's drift onward, to the next part in this long, quiet journey through history's strangely sleepy tragedies. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive, and if you're already drifting, that's perfectly fine. Just let the words wash over you like a very soft political meltdown. Tonight, we're gliding into the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, a period where almost every Roman leader made decisions that could only be described as poorly considered, especially when done on an empty stomach. So, settle in again, adjust a pillow, let your breathing slow, and let's wander into Rome's uneasy morning after the Ides of March, a capital in a panic, and an odd kind of silence. After Caesar collapsed on the Senate floor, and the conspirators ran because, naturally, they hadn't planned what to do after killing the most powerful man in the world, Rome fell into a strange hush, not dramatic, not filled with screaming crowds, more of a widespread citywide "oh no, what now?" that hung in the air like stale incense. People peeked out of shop doors, they whispered, they avoided gathering in groups, because no one knew whether they were supposed to celebrate or hide under a table. Some Romans genuinely loved the Republic, some genuinely loved Caesar, and many loved whichever side was currently offering free grain. But most of all, they feared instability. Rome had been through several decades of civil wars, streets filled with fighting, proscriptions, heads displayed in public squares. When a politician died violently, it usually signaled more unpleasant things on the horizon. So when word spread that Caesar had been stabbed by senators, about 60 of them, which was frankly excessive, most ordinary Romans did not cheer. They tightened their cloaks, they walked home, they locked their doors. Only a handful of senators, conspirators included, tried to give speeches about restoring liberty. These speeches were delivered to audiences, consisting almost entirely of terrified pigeons. Which brings us to Mark Antony, the man who wasn't supposed to keep his cool. Mark Antony, Caesar's colleague, loyal friend, and occasionally a human embodiment of an expensive banquet, was in an awkward position. On the day of the assassination, he had been distracted outside the Senate house long enough to avoid being stabbed. A lucky break, considering several conspirators had planned to kill him too. But then someone pointed out Antony had a habit of turning small grudges into lifelong vendettas, so perhaps leaving him alive wasn't wise. Too late now. Antony, unsurprisingly, was furious, but he also had a rare moment of clarity. Instead of marching into the streets with soldiers or storming the Senate, he kept things quiet, calm, almost suspiciously reasonable. And this was alarming, because when a man known for overindulgence suddenly becomes diplomatic, something is wrong. Antony contacted the conspirators, not to scream at them, but to negotiate. Because in Rome, murder could be forgiven, but instability? Absolutely not. The peculiar compromise no one really liked. After a long series of tense discussions, a deal emerged. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and the rest would be forgiven, not because anyone liked them, but because punishing 60 senators at once usually created a shortage of experienced murderers for the next political crisis. Caesar's laws and decrees would remain in force. A delightful irony, considering the conspirators had killed him primarily to stop him from making new policies. Antony would oversee Caesar's will and funeral. This would either go smoothly, or become the spark of yet another civil war. And to absolutely no one's surprise, it was the latter. The compromise pleased no one, not even the pigeons, but it maintained temporary calm, just enough breathing room for Antony to make his move. Caesar's will. And one very unexpected air. When Antony opened Caesar's will, he discovered something that must have made him blink several times. Caesar had adopted a teenager, not a powerful general, not a seasoned senator, not even a wealthy nobleman who could bribe crowds with bread and free sandals. No, Caesar had adopted an 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, a quiet, sickly, studious boy from a respectable but not dazzlingly important family. A boy who got fevers more often than Antony got hangovers. No one saw this coming, especially the teenager. Octavius, soon to be known as Octavian, was studying abroad when news arrived, and as he read the part where Caesar named him heir to his fortune, his name and his political legacy, he must have felt the ancient Roman equivalent of being added to a group chat he never asked to join. While many Romans assumed Antony would seize power immediately, this small clause in Caesar's will would slowly, gently, but thoroughly ruin Antony's plans. But for now, Antony was focused on something more pressing: Caesar's funeral. The funeral that wasn't supposed to be dramatic, but naturally was. The conspirators had hoped for a quiet funeral, a modest ceremony, preferably one without a vengeful mob. Antony, however, had other ideas. He stood before the crowd, holding Caesar's blood-stained toga, not gently washed, not respectfully folded. No, Antony had kept it exactly as it had fallen on the Senate floor, because nothing inspires public outrage quite like visible stab holes. He spoke softly, calmly, persuasively. He did not shout. He did not rage. He did not point fingers. He simply drifted through a speech that made every Roman in the crowd imagine themselves lying on that Senate floor. He described Caesar's victories, Caesar's generosity, how he had refused the crown at least publicly 3 times, how he had left money in his will for every Roman citizen, how he had pardoned the very men who murdered him. Antony, for once in his life, displayed genuine emotional intelligence, and that was the moment everything fell apart. The crowd began to stir, quietly, then louder, then violently. Someone brought out a wooden bench, someone else brought planks, someone else brought household items, and soon Caesar's body was burning on a makeshift pyre built out of furniture, fencing, and whatever could be grabbed quickly. Rome had entered full emotional chaos. The conspirators fled again, this time leaving Rome entirely, because Antony's speech had effectively converted half the city into an angry, grief-driven mob seeking justice, which in Roman political language meant revenge plus light property damage. Into the vacuum steps a teenager. While Rome descended into fear and uncertainty, Octavian quietly sailed home. He was small, pale, and unimpressive at first glance. Not the type of man anyone associated with legendary power. People looked at him and thought, he needs soup and a day off. But beneath his fragile exterior was a mind sharper than most marble inscriptions. Octavian arrived in Rome with 3 assets: Caesar's name, Caesar's fortune, a calm, unnervingly patient personality. He visited Antony, politely, respectfully, and Antony, who was used to young men being intimidated by him, dismissed Octavian as harmless. This was, historically speaking, not a wise evaluation. A slow political dance between Antony and Octavian. At first, Antony tried to control everything. He seized Caesar's papers, he controlled Caesar's soldiers, he handled Caesar's clients, and he assumed Octavian would quietly leave politics to him. But Octavian began doing what truly dangerous people do. He made friends, he charmed senators, he visited Caesar's veterans, he gave out money from Caesar's will, something Antony had neglected to do, which made him look greedy. Slowly, softly, imperceptibly, Octavian built influence. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he didn't storm into buildings the way Antony did. He simply outmaneuvered everyone with the gentle, methodical patience of someone organizing scrolls in a library. Antony, meanwhile, misread the situation entirely. He began attacking political rivals. He tried seizing territory in Gaul. He made speeches. He made enemies. He made several questionable life choices while drunk. And as Antony's popularity wavered, Octavian's rose quietly. Like a tide, no one noticed until their sandals were wet. The Senate's convenient, sleep-deprived decision. The Senate, led by Cicero, the famous orator, who loved long speeches almost as much as he loved disliking. Antony began to see Octavian as a useful tool, a delicate, agreeable, easily manipulated tool. Spoiler, this was also incorrect. Cicero delivered a series of speeches attacking Antony, known as the Philippics. They were harsh, clever, unnecessary at 2 in the morning. But Cicero enjoyed dramatic monologues far more than was healthy. He portrayed Antony as unhinged, dangerous, a drunkard, a threat to Rome, and he portrayed Octavian as the boy who will save the Republic. Octavian smiled politely at all this. This smile should have worried people. And then Antony did something that made everything worse. Antony marched on Mutina, a city in northern Italy, and besieged Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins. This sounds heroic, admirable, exactly what Caesar's heir should want, except Antony wasn't doing this for justice. He was doing it to strengthen his own position. And the Senate, confused but determined to oppose Antony, declared him an enemy of the state. They sent 2 consuls and Octavian to fight him. Yes, the teenager, the fever-prone one, the one who sometimes needed help mounting a horse. They sent him to command troops against one of Rome's most seasoned generals, and unbelievably, it worked. Antony was defeated at Mutina. The consuls died in battle, very inconvenient, and Octavian, with his quiet eyes and unnervingly stable temperament, was suddenly the only commander left with a functioning army. Antony retreated toward Gaul to link up with his ally Lepidus. Octavian returned to Rome to be celebrated, but celebration wasn't what he wanted, because now he wanted power. The moment everyone should have started panicking upon returning to Rome, Octavian demanded something unusual. The Senate must recognize him as consul. This was bold, nearly unheard of. The position required age, experience, and prestige. Octavian had none of these. He was young, he was technically inexperienced, and he spent several weeks of the year recovering from fevers. But he had an army, which, historically, has always outweighed paperwork. The Senate refused. Octavian marched on Rome. The Senate quickly changed its mind, and so the sickly teenager became consul at age 19, a record that would never be broken, because it was such a remarkably questionable idea. The second triumvirate of political sleep paralysis dream, Antony and Lepidus, seeing the situation from afar, realized Octavian had become far more dangerous than anticipated, so they met with him, not to fight, but to negotiate. The result was the second triumvirate, a 3-man dictatorship, legally established, officially recognized, and designed, in theory, to stabilize Rome. In practice, it created proscriptions, confiscations, executions, property seizures, and the general sense that everyone might want to lie down for a century. One of the triumvirate's first decisions was a list of political enemies to eliminate. Several senators were targeted: wealthy equestrians, rival commanders, and Cicero, who had insulted Antony many times, found his name at the top. Octavian, who had smiled politely while Cicero praised him, now calmly allowed Cicero to be hunted down and killed. It was not personal, it was simply convenient, a pattern that would define his entire future. The world drifts toward another civil war with Rome under the triumvirate. The next step was revenge against Caesar's assassins. Brutus and Cassius had fled to the east. They had raised an army. They had secured funds from friendly provinces. They had convinced themselves they were fighting for freedom, and the triumvirate sent their legions to crush them. Thus began the long, weary march toward the Battle of Philippi. A battle fought slowly, across muddy fields in miserable weather, with soldiers on both sides wondering why the Republic always seemed to find new ways to ruin their plans for retirement. But that is where we'll drift next, in the coming section. For now, inhale, exhale, and let Rome's murmuring chaos dissolve into a soft haze. The conspirators have fled. Antony is bruised. Octavian is rising. And the Republic, as always, is quietly collapsing in the background. Whenever you're ready to continue, just say, "Hey everyone, welcome back." If your eyes are already heavy, that's okay. Tonight's bit of Roman history is one of the few battle-filled stories that still somehow feels like the world's most ancient bureaucratic meltdown. So get comfortable, loosen your shoulders, let your breathing soften, and let S float gently toward the Battle of Philippi, battle that was supposed to save the Republic, but instead quietly wrapped it in a blanket and told it to go to sleep forever. No need to stay fully awake, just drift along with me. A republic on life support, and 2 men who really should have taken a vacation. By the time Brutus and Cassius settled into their positions in the eastern half of the Roman world, they were painfully aware that events in Italy were not going their way. The triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, had seized power with the subtlety of a chariot race through someone's vegetable garden. Worse, the new regime had begun issuing prescriptions lists of people to be executed and property confiscated. It was the Roman equivalent of a very aggressive spring cleaning. Cicero had already fallen victim. Many aristocrats had fled east, and these refugees now looked to Brutus and Cassius as their only hope, which must have been exhausting. Brutus, usually introverted and philosophical, had never imagined he'd spend his life running a military coalition. Cassius, sharper and more calculating, understood the stakes, but was slowly developing headaches that probably lasted his entire remaining life. Neither of them wanted another civil war, but they were getting one anyway, and so they gathered armies. They collected taxes, they stacked grain supplies, they wrote letters filled with confident-sounding sentences, and quietly prayed no one would notice how stressed they were. Meanwhile, Octavian was having a truly terrible time while the conspirators built their forces. Octavian was lying on a cot, probably contemplating every decision that had led him to this point. He had fallen ill again. His health was chronically fragile, the sort of constitution that made even mild weather seem personally offensive to him. His soldiers adored Antony, who was charismatic, loud, and always eager for a drink. Octavian was none of those things. He was pale. He was serious. He was the type of young man who read strategy scrolls while other commanders were still lacing their sandals. But he was also Caesar's heir, and even when bedridden, he maintained a quiet, absolute determination that unsettled people. His soldiers respected it, maybe even feared it a little. Antony, meanwhile, strode around with the confidence of a man who had once eaten an entire roasted boar on a dare. He laughed, he gave speeches. He reminded the troops that he had fought alongside Caesar. If Octavian represented chilly calculation, Antony was a warm campfire, sometimes literally, because he liked his tents incredibly hot. The two men were not natural allies. They barely tolerated each other. But the triumvirate needed unity long enough to defeat Brutus and Cassius. Rome, as usual, had a habit of forcing people into awkward partnerships. A slow march toward Philippi by late 42 BCE, the triumvirs sailed east to confront their enemies. The crossing was rough storms, delays, miserable wind, soldiers slipping on wet decks while cursing the gods. But eventually they assembled roughly 28 legions, a staggering number of troops, enough men to eat an entire province out of grain within a month, which they happily did. Brutus and Cassius had 19 legions themselves, positioned across the plains of Philippi, region of soft rolling hills, damp air, and unfortunate tactical visibility. They built fortified camps, dug trenches, and waited. War is often depicted as dramatic, but in truth, it's mostly waiting, complaining about weather, and hoping your shoes survive. At Philippi, this was even more true. There were days where both armies simply stared at each other from a distance, pretending they were very confident. Antony wanted immediate battle. Octavian, still recovering from illness, did not. Cassius wanted to avoid battle entirely. Brutus, idealistic as always, hoped the gods would send a sign. Naturally, the gods did nothing. The first battle messy, confused, and exhausting. The first clash came on a foggy morning. Antony's troops advanced toward Cassius' fortified position. The fog created confusion, dense and heavy, like someone had spread wet wool across the sky. Soldiers stumbled, orders were misheard. But Antony, to his credit, handled chaos well. He attacked one section of Cassius' line, collapsed it, and stormed the camp. Meanwhile, on the opposite flank, Brutus attacked Octavian's forces with unexpected enthusiasm. Octavian, who had been resting in a nearby tent, narrowly avoided being trampled. His troops fled. Brutus' men seized Octavian's camp, finding, according to later gossip, the bed where he had been lying moments before. Depending on the historian you believe, they also found a symbolic golden statue of Caesar, which must have made the moment especially uncomfortable. Both sides technically won something that day, which always makes battles less satisfying. Antony crushed Cassius' position, Brutus crushed Octavian's. The battlefield quickly dissolved into a tired, bruised mess. But Cassius didn't know about Brutus' victory. From a hill, Cassius saw his camp burning and assumed everything was lost. Miscommunication. Rome's true ruling power sealed his fate. He ordered a servant to assist in his suicide, and so, the sharper mind of the conspiracy was extinguished by fog and exhaustion. When Brutus learned what had happened, he must have felt the quiet despair of someone realizing he'd inherited a disaster he didn't ask for. Brutus' slow, inevitable collapse, the death of Cassius, broke something inside Brutus. He had always been the moral thinker, the idealist, the man who convinced himself that killing Caesar was a noble act. But leading a massive army in a grinding, miserable war was draining his spirit. His officers noticed, his soldiers noticed. He looked tired, his letters became shorter, he spoke less. He walked the camp at night, softly, as if listening for something that wasn't there. Even his dreams shifted. Several ancient writers say he dreamed of a silent spectre, Caesar's ghost, who appeared in his tent. Whether true or invented, the image fits. Brutus wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid the entire cause had been pointless, which, historically speaking, it was. The second battle, the end of the Republic's last stand. A few weeks later, the armies clashed again. No fog this time, no surprise victories. Just tired men fighting on muddy ground while crows watched from trees, waiting for a meal. Brutus' army fought bravely, but Antony's forces gradually pushed them back. The legions Octavian commanded finally stabilized, contributed as well. Though Antony remained the dominant force on the field, Brutus' lines broke, units fled, confusion rippled outward. Brutus retreated to a hill overlooking the field, surrounded by loyal officers. But he knew, he had always known what defeat required of a Roman commander. He thanked his friends, he spoke calmly, and he took his own life. It was not dramatic, it was not noble. It was simply the quiet collapse of a man who believed he was fighting for the soul of Rome, only to discover that Rome had grown weary of souls and preferred stability instead. When Octavian and Antony received news of Brutus' death, they reacted differently. Antony wept, perhaps genuinely, perhaps performatively, or perhaps because Antony cried at many things, including good wine. Octavian remained composed. He ordered Brutus' body not to be displayed or desecrated. A small mercy, delivered with the chilly efficiency that had already begun defining him. The last major defenders of the Republic were gone, and the world exhaled. Reorganizing a shaky empire after the victory at Philippi, the triumvirs divided the Roman world, like three men splitting a very large, very complex pizza. Antony took the wealthy eastern provinces, Greece, Asia, Syria, and eventually Egypt. Octavian took the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and responsibility for settling thousands of veterans who expected land immediately. Lepidus received Africa, which was the political equivalent of being handed a clipboard and told to look busy. This arrangement looked stable on paper, but paper in Rome was never to be trusted. In reality, Antony and Octavian were already drifting toward inevitable conflict. Antony considered himself the senior partner, older, experienced, battle-tested, and continually annoyed with Octavian's existence. Octavian, meanwhile, quietly observed Antony's decisions, took notes, and waited. Lepidus simply existed. He had mastered the art of political invisibility. Octavian's very sleepy land crisis back in Italy. Octavian faced a nightmare disguised as bureaucracy. Tens of thousands of veterans needed farmland. Veterans were loyal. Veterans were dangerous. Veterans wanted compensation. And Octavian, committed to holding on to power, could not risk losing their support, so he confiscated land. A lot of land. From towns, from wealthy families, from people who had absolutely nothing to do with the civil war. This created resentment, unrest, small rebellions, angry petitions, and one very annoyed noblewoman named Fulvia, Antony's wife, who became furious on Antony's behalf and would shortly attempt to start a war about it. None of this was restful, and Octavian, whose health suffered under stress, spent many months moving between military operations and extended periods of recuperation. He pushed himself too hard. His forces mutinied more than once. His friends were overwhelmed. Italy simmered like an overworked cooking pot. And then Antony made everything worse. Antony goes east and finds Cleopatra. Antony traveled to the eastern provinces to reorganize affairs, reward allies, and raise money for future campaigns. He was charismatic. He excelled at charming local rulers. He enjoyed banquets, and he found all of these qualities greatly appreciated by the reigning queen of Egypt, Cleopatra VII. Antony and Cleopatra had met before, but now, as Antony sought wealth and support, Cleopatra offered both. Wrapped in political elegance, personal magnetism, and the sort of luxury Antony found irresistible. They became allies, then lovers, then parents to several children. Rome, hearing the rumors, raised its collective eyebrows. Some senators muttered disapproval. Some gossip spread. Octavian, hearing every detail, filed it away for future use. Antony believed he was securing the East. In reality, he was slowly handing Octavian the best propaganda material in Roman history. But that's something we'll drift into in the next part, because for now, the world of Rome is exhausted. Brutus and Cassius are gone. The Republic has breathed its last. Antony is in the east, Octavian is in the west, and their alliance already cracked will soon fracture in ways that reshape everything. So let your shoulders relax, let your eyes soften, and whenever you're ready to continue, just say, "Hey everyone, welcome back." If you're still awake, which would be surprising, and honestly, I'm not rooting for that, let's stretch out. Adjust the pillow, dim the lights just a little more, and drift back into the gently smoldering disaster that was Rome in the days after Julius Caesar's murder. In the last section, we watched Brutus and Cassius realize that restoring the Republic somehow came with far fewer grateful crowds and far more panicked senators than they expected. And now, in part 4, everything gets even more sleepily chaotic. Because of course it does. Let's drift back in. The calm before the bonfire Rome, in the days after Caesar's murder, entered a state best described as pretending things are fine while absolutely nothing is fine. People whispered. Doors stayed closed. Even the street dogs were quieter than usual, probably sensing that something had gone terribly wrong though. To be fair, they might have just been confused by the sudden senator-shaped footprints in the forum. Brutus and Cassius tried very hard to look calm. They walked around in their white togas, speaking gently, trying to appear like wise guardians of ancient liberty, but their eyes twitched. Their hands shook when they thought no one was looking, and their speeches contained an awful lot of "trust us, this is good for everyone," which is never a comforting phrase from political leaders. Meanwhile, Mark Antony did something unusual. He stayed quiet, truly frightening. People expected him to explode, call in gladiators, or possibly throw Cassius off a balcony. But Antony understood something. Silence is much more dangerous, and much more dramatic. And, as we established earlier, Antony loved a dramatic entrance, so he waited. Brutus attempts a speech. Rome remains unconvinced because the conspirators believed in the power of tradition and, also because they were absolutely out of ideas. Brutus stepped forward to deliver a serious, dignified speech, explaining the assassination. He spoke of liberty, he spoke of tyranny, he reminded the people that he came from a long line of republic rescuers. He praised Caesar's virtues, but insisted the man had grown too ambitious. It was all very polite, very philosophical, and very sleepy, but the Roman crowd didn't feel enlightened. They felt confused. Caesar had fed them, he had entertained them, he had promised more reforms, he had won almost every battle he attempted, including some he absolutely should have lost. And yes, he may have been a little power-hungry, but so was literally every Roman politician. Ambition in Rome was like oxygen. Everyone breathed it, and occasionally someone tried to inhale the entire atmosphere. So when Brutus finished his calm, noble speech, the reaction was tepid. A few polite claps, a few shrugs, some awkward coughing. Rome wasn't ready to hate Caesar. They weren't ready to love Brutus, and they definitely weren't ready to process a political murder without any snacks. And right at that moment, just when the air was uncertain, heavy and waiting, Mark Antony finally decided to step forward. Naturally, Antony's just a few words. You may already know this moment from Shakespeare's version, the famous Friends, Romans, Countrymen speech, but the real-life version was even more skillful and more quietly dangerous. Antony stood in front of the crowd. He said he wasn't here to stir them up. He said he respected the conspirators. He said he only wanted to honor Caesar with a funeral, which was true, sort of. He did want a funeral, just one that involved fire, tears, and possibly a riot. He asked the people for permission to read Caesar's will. He did this gently, as though the will was nothing interesting. He made them beg for it, because that's what experts in emotional timing do. And when the crowd finally insisted, He revealed exactly what he had been holding back. Caesar had left them money, real money, a personal gift to every Roman citizen. And suddenly, the crowd, which had been lukewarm about this whole assassination business, felt differently, dramatically differently. Caesar wasn't just their leader. He wasn't just a popular general. He wasn't just a political figure. He had become, at that moment, the man who remembered them in his will. A man who loved them more than the senators ever had. A man who, despite being stabbed 23 times in a room full of wealthy men, still cared about ordinary people. From that quiet moment, Antony had the crowd in his hand, and he knew it. The funeral pyre that should not have happened. When Caesar's body was brought out for the funeral, Antony subtly guided the emotions like a maestro conducting a sleepy but dangerous orchestra. He held up the blood-soaked toga. He pointed out the stab wounds. He named who had delivered each one, sometimes with little pauses for effect. It was political theater, but in a low, mournful tone that made the whole moment feel deeply tragic. The crowd began to weep, then shout, then tremble with anger, and then all at once, they lost their sense of order. Someone threw burning sticks onto the bier, others tossed furniture. A few enthusiastic individuals may have added entire benches, and the next thing anyone knew, Caesar's funeral turned into a raging bonfire in the middle of the forum. Rome was, officially, on fire, and with that fire came something even more dangerous, a shift in public opinion. Brutus and Cassius had hoped that people would see their act as heroic. Instead, they were seen as murderers, traitors, and perhaps worst of all, ungrateful. Antony, on the other hand, walked away from that pyre glowing with political energy. Not literally glowing, though given the fire behind him, the visual might have suggested it. The moment the flames rose, the conspirators' fate was sealed. They had lost, they just didn't know it yet. The conspirators flee, slowly and awkwardly. You might expect Brutus and Cassius to flee Rome immediately after the funeral. But, in true late Republic fashion, they procrastinated. They held meetings, they discussed strategy, they reassured each other that the Republic would be restored any day now. Meanwhile, Antony gathered allies. He approached Lepidus, a wealthy aristocrat who owned several legions and had the personality of damp bread, pleasant, soft, and remarkably easy to shape. Lepidus was happy to stand beside Antony as long as Antony let him feel important. Together, they formed a temporary alliance. And while Brutus and Cassius were still debating the ethics of leaving Rome too quickly, perhaps worried it would make them look guilty, Antony and Lepidus took control of the city. At last, when the political temperature reached absolutely melting, the conspirators slipped away. Some headed east, hoping to gather troops. Others simply disappeared. Rome, meanwhile, began drifting toward the next enormous mistake. Octavian returns, and he looks surprisingly fragile around this time. Another key figure arrived in Rome. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir. He was 18. He was sickly. He had the physical presence of a librarian who always stands behind the desk. And many senators looked at him and thought, finally someone harmless. Spoiler, he was absolutely not harmless. But Rome didn't know that yet. Octavian came quietly. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply informed the Senate and the people that Caesar had made him his legal son and primary heir, which meant he inherited Caesar's name. He inherited Caesar's wealth, and, more symbolically, he inherited Caesar's political destiny. Antony assumed he could push the teenager aside. After all, Antony was a grown man, a veteran general, and built like a marble statue with an alcohol problem. Octavian, on the other hand, looked like he might faint if he asked him to lift a shield. Naturally, Antony underestimated him, and naturally, that was a mistake. The quiet rivalry begins. Octavian didn't challenge Antony openly. He spoke softly. He made polite visits. He gathered support among Caesar's veterans by paying them out of his own pocket. This shocked everyone. People were used to politicians making promises, not actual payments. But Octavian understood something essential. Loyalty is expensive, but it's also incredibly effective. Every coin he handed out was a quiet message. I am Caesar's true heir. I'm the one who remembers you. Antony, meanwhile, continued to host gatherings, give speeches, and show off his popularity. But popularity alone doesn't guarantee control. And soon, Rome began whispering. Some whispered that Antony was taking too much power. Others whispered that Octavian was more mature than expected. Still others whispered simply because Romans enjoyed whispering. It was practically a civic pastime. The Senate tries to choose a favorite. The Senate, in its eternal tradition of terrible timing, decided to support Octavian not because they believed in him, but because they hoped he could be used against Antony. This is a classic Roman political move. Choose the youngest possible candidate and assume he lacks ambition. The Senate had apparently forgotten every ambitious teenager who had ever lived. Octavian accepted their support very politely. He thanked them. He agreed to assist. He nodded humbly at their suggestions. And then, quietly, strategically, he began making his own decisions. Antony saw what was happening. He was not impressed. Their rivalry, which at first was soft and political, soon shifted into something more openly dangerous. Rome braced itself. Everyone sensed a storm coming, slow, heavy, and inevitable. The drift toward the First Civil War. Antony marched north to secure territory in Cisalpine Gaul. The Senate ordered him to stop. Antony, in true Antony fashion, pretended not to hear them. The Senate sent armies against him. Octavian joined those armies because why not accelerate the conflict when the opportunity is warm? Soon enough, Octavian's troops and the Senate's forces were marching toward Antony. It was the first open military clash between Caesar's two most important heirs. Meanwhile, the conspirators watched this whole thing from afar with deep confusion. They had expected to be the main characters. Instead, they had become background noise. Brutus scribbled letters complaining about Antony. Cassius tried raising armies, but their influence already felt faint, ghost-like, overshadowed by the quietly rising Octavian. And yet, the real twist was still ahead. The battle between Antony and the Senate was short and inconclusive. Antony took some losses. He retreated. Octavian decided the Senate was using him. And then, in a move that shocked literally everyone except the audience of history itself, Octavian switched sides. He approached Antony. He proposed a deal. He suggested they stop fighting each other and share power. Antony hesitated. Lepidus nodded politely, and Octavian continued speaking in that delicate, careful tone that disguised his ambitions beautifully. Soon enough, a new alliance formed. Not a friendly alliance, not a peaceful one, but an efficient one. The Second Triumvirate, a three-man dictatorship. Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, the decorative one. And once they joined forces, the fate of Brutus, Cassius, and the entire Republic rolled quietly into place like a stone drifting down a hill, gathering speed without anyone pushing. But that's a tale for the next sleepy chapter. Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and settle deeper into your blankets. Let your room lights drop to that quiet, late evening glow. Tonight, we're drifting away from the marble politics of ancient Rome and sliding softly into the narrow, crooked, slightly smelly world of Tudor Londoner, place where ambition was high, ceilings were low, and hygiene was deepestically attempted. Take a slow breath, because Tudor London never moved fast, not unless the authorities were chasing you. Let's drift in, a sleepy walk through the old city walls. Imagine the city at dawn, not the soft, pastel Instagram kind of dawn, but the Tudor version, grey, damp, and gently infused with chimney smoke. The kind of dawn that made people say, yes, this is fine, while wiping soot off their upper lip. The old Roman walls still stood, though cracks ran through them like tired wrinkles. Gates opened one by one. Carts rattled over cobblestones. A milk seller shouted that his milk was absolutely fresh, which in Tudor London meant at least younger than you. Inside the walls, the streets felt more like a maze designed specifically to confuse newcomers. Houses leaned inward, as if whispering gossip to each other. Some were so crooked they resembled structures built by well-meaning children with questionable hand-eye coordination. And already, even this early, the city was awake. Or at least, Tudor awake. Groggy, gritty, and economically motivated. The sounds, the smells, and the things nobody talks about. Some historical eras you wish had smell-o-vision. Tudor London is not one of them, because the moment you stepped outside, you were greeted by wood smoke ale brewing fish that had definitely been dead for a while, and the faint but omnipresent aroma of human life lived very publicly. People dumped chamber pots into the street, sometimes with a half-hearted warning shout of Gardy-Loo, which roughly translated to move if you want to survive. Sewage drifted toward shallow gutters. Animals walked everywhere. Even the occasional escaped pig trotted through the lanes like it paid rent. Yet somehow, the city functioned, not cleanly, not politely, but effectively, because Tudor Londoners had mastered the ancient art of pretending unpleasant things didn't exist unless they stepped directly on them. Street vendors, the sleepy backbone of the city. If you drifted through Cheapside, the main commercial artery, you'd hear vendors calling out in rhythmic patterns, almost musical, except no one was in tune. Fishwives shouted about their fresh catches. Bread sellers carried baskets on their hips. Herb sellers offered small bundles of mint, rosemary, or vague green things that could either cure a cold or make it significantly worse. Every trade had a sound, every sound layered into the daily hum, and beneath that hum was the constant shuffle of people who were mostly awake, partly skeptical, and fully trying not to get robbed, because pickpocketing was practically a sport, and Tudor pickpockets were professionals, not the clumsy, cartoonish kind, but sleek, experienced individuals with nimble fingers and absolutely no guilt. A distracted gentleman might reach for his coin pouch and discover that either A. it was gone, B. it had been replaced with a rock of roughly equal weight, or C. it never existed and he had simply dreamed of being wealthy. Tudor London was unpredictable like that. Children everywhere, doing everything. Children were abundant. Some were working, some were loitering, some were sprinting through the streets with the exact chaotic energy of small dogs who spotted another small dog. They swept doorways, they carried water, they begged, they sold apples. They learned informally that life required quick reflexes and the ability to dodge carts. Their idea of fun often included rolling hoops, shouting at each other, playing games with balls whose cleanliness was optimistic, and occasionally setting something on fire to see what would happen. Adults usually intervened, but only if the fire spread to something valuable. The Thames, highway, lifeline, and occasional disaster site. Now let's drift toward the river. The Thames, wide and sluggish, carrying boats, hopes, and possibly several objects people hoped no one would find. The river was the city's main transportation route. Watermen ferried passengers across for a few pennies. Boats carrying wool, coal, timber, and questionable barrels drifted past slow barges. The watermen were known for their colorful insults, usually delivered with the calm tone of someone who deepened rowing since sunrise and could not emotionally afford politeness anymore. You could pay a waterman to cross the river. You could pay slightly more to be insulted while crossing. Either way, you landed on the opposite bank with your dignity mostly intact, unless you fell in, which people did, frequently. If you fell into the Thames during Tudor times, you emerged, colder, wetter, dirtier, and somewhat spiritually changed. Most people climbed out quietly, pretending the experience had been intentional. The neighborhoods, each with its own sleepy personality. London wasn't one city. It was a cluster of little worlds squashed together. Cheapside, the marketplace, busy, loud, and filled with more smells than one lifetime should contain. Southwark, the entertaining one across the river, technically outside city jurisdiction, which meant theatres, bear-baiting pits, taverns, more taverns, extremely questionable taverns. It was the Tudor equivalent of the fun district, where people went to unwind and sometimes forgot to come home on time. Smithfield, the animal zone, livestock everywhere. Cows being herded, sheep being traded, occasional arguments about the price of a pig. It was lively, it was noisy, and it was definitely not a place for white shoes. The Liberties, the slightly suspicious places, areas just outside official control, perfect for people who disliked taxes, rules, or being found. Food on the move street. Food existed long before modern food trucks. Tudor Londoners loved grabbing a quick bite while walking. Your choices included meat pies, contents sometimes clear, sometimes mysterious, bread with butter, hot eel stew, roasted nutsail. Because drinking water was basically gambling, eel stands were everywhere. Londoners adored eels, possibly because they were affordable, abundant, and didn't ask questions about their own preparation. Some food sellers shouted catchy phrases, others simply held up the product silently, relying on eye contact and hunger to close the sale. It worked surprisingly well. The people you'd meet on a relaxed walk, a quiet evening stroll through Tudor London might introduce you to a full cast of characters. The night watchman, who carried a lantern and a staff and took his job seriously, even though he rarely caught anyone doing anything. The barber surgeon, who shaved beards, pulled teeth, and occasionally performed surgery with the same tools and roughly the same enthusiasm. The alewife, who ran a small tavern and knew absolutely everyone's business. The scribe, writing letters for those who couldn't write, usually embellishing them just a little, for flair. The apprentice, exhausted, underpaid, and dreaming of one day owning a shop where he could underpay his own apprentices. Everyone in Tudor London had a role. Everyone belonged to some piece of the city's humming machinery. And everyone, without exception, walked everywhere, unless they were wealthy, in which case they rode on horseback while looking slightly guilty about it. Evenings in the city, quiet, dim, and gently suspicious as the sun set early in the winter. Pleasantly late in the summer the city changed. Shops closed, candles flickered behind windows, alehouses glowed warmly, drawing people with promises of cheap drink and cheaper company. The streets darkened quickly, because street lighting did not exist in any meaningful sense. People timed their errands carefully. No one enjoyed walking through a shadowed alley while listening to footsteps behind them. Night in Tudor London was calm, but in the way a cat is calm, quiet, mysterious, and potentially plotting something. Still, there was a certain charm. You could hear distant singing from a tavern. You could hear the soft splash of the river. You could hear the gentle creaking of old timber houses settling in for the night. And occasionally, the night watchman shouting all's well, even when absolutely nothing was. Sleepy closing thoughts on this narrow, noisy, endlessly alive city. Tudor London wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It wasn't clean, it wasn't orderly, it wasn't peaceful, but it was alive, fully, relentlessly, sleepily alive. A place where thousands of people lived within a space smaller than a modern city district. A place where ambition thrived, where gossip moved faster than horses, where fortunes were made, lost, and occasionally misplaced in the Thames. And though we see it now through the haze of nostalgia, or thick chimney smoke, it remains one of history's most vivid settings, and also one of its most likely to give modern urban planners nightmares. But for tonight, it's simply a quiet memory, a brick and timber dreamscape, perfect to drift off to. When you're ready, just say, "Hey everyone, welcome back." If you're still awake, that's impressive, but truly not required. Tonight, we're slipping off the streets of Tudor London past the gutters, the vendors, the wandering pigs, and stepping quietly through the crooked wooden door of an ordinary Tudor home. A place where ceilings were low, floors were uneven, and privacy was a mythical concept, like dragons or affordable bread. So dim the lights, breathe slowly, and drift with me into the warm, smoky interior of Tudor domestic life. Stepping through the door, welcome to a timeless sneeze. The first thing you would notice before the people, before the furniture, before even the warmth of the hearth was the dust, not the gentle floating dust you see in modern sunlight. No, Tudor dust was committed, ambitious, practically unionized. It settled on beams, shelves, beds, and occasionally visitors. You stepped inside and immediately inhaled a mixture of wood smoke, dried herbs, wool, and whatever spices the household could afford this month. It wasn't unpleasant, just earthy. The smell of life lived closely, loudly, and mostly indoors, and the whole room tilted slightly left because the house itself was politely collapsing in slow motion. The main room, the Tudor multi-purpose space. Tudor houses, especially those in London, rarely had more than one or two main rooms on the lower floor. The largest of these rooms served every imaginable function: kitchen, dining area, workspace, social room, sleeping area for apprentices, guests, and anyone who claimed to be just visiting for a few days and then stayed 6 months. A large open hearth dominated the space, not the elegant fireplace of later centuries, but a wide, almost medieval fire pit, framed by heavy stones. Pots hung over it, bread baked beside it, people dried wet wool socks near it, and sometimes someone burned themselves, which was considered an unavoidable occupational hazard of life. The hearth gave the house warmth. It also filled it with smoke-soft, thin, persistent smoke that drifted just overhead like a quiet ceiling ghost. People didn't mind, or rather, they pretended not to mind, which was the Tudor approach to most problems. Furniture, simple, sturdy, and occasionally confused. The furniture in a typical Tudor home was built from thick oak, usually by someone who believed furniture should last at least 4 generations. Chairs were heavy, tables were heavier, benches were technically portable, but only if the person lifting them had the strength of 3 modern gym trainers. A Tudor table didn't wobble. If it wobbled, you simply wedged something under one leg until it stopped. Bed frames were also wooden and frequently scandalously small by modern standards. People slept curled up, not because it was comfortable, but because medieval houses kept heat about as effectively as a perforated bucket, and pillows. If you had one, congratulations. If not, you used whatever was soft and roughly rectangular. Lighting, mostly hoping for daylight candles, existed, of course, but unless you were wealthy, you didn't use many. You saved them for guests' religious holidays, writing important letters, or moments when you suspected the neighbor was judging your household, which neighbors frequently were. Most evenings were spent in low, amber light from the fire. Shadows played along the ceiling beams. The room flickered softly, and people accepted this dimness as perfectly normal. After all, Tudor London didn't try to conquer darkness, it simply coexisted with it. The kitchen, where everything happened all at once. The Tudor kitchen wasn't a separate space knot in most homes. It lived in the main room, humming with activity from dawn until late evening. Here, you'd find a large pot of pottage simmering bread dough rising under a cloth, dried herbs hanging from rafters like little upside-down brooms. Cooking tools that were both multi-purpose and vaguely intimidating. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, ale, bread, fish, ale, bread, onions, ale, bread, eel, ale, and on special days, bread, meat, and ale. People didn't drink water because water did not believe in cleanliness at this stage of history. Children helped with cooking, servants helped if a household could afford them, and someone always had a small burn mark on their sleeve, because fire safety was not a Tudor priority. Upstairs, if you were lucky enough to have an upstairs, if we climbed the wooden stairs carefully, because Tudor stairs were steep, narrow, and occasionally existential, you'd reach the upper rooms. The floorboards creaked constantly, creating a soft background soundtrack of possibly ghosts, probably just old wood. These rooms served as sleeping spaces. Beds were stuffed with straw or feathers. Sheets existed but were washed far less frequently than modern sensibilities would approve. Curtains hung from wooden frames to keep out drafts and retain privacy, though acoustically they accomplished absolutely nothing. A family might share one bed. A larger family shared 2. Guests squeezed wherever they could. People slept fully dressed in winter, partly dressed in summer, and always with at least one blanket that smelled vaguely like smoke and cooked onions. Clothing storage, mostly hope, and a chest. Tudor wardrobes were not built like modern closets. In fact, closets didn't really exist. People stored clothing in chests, large wooden boxes with carved lids and iron hinges. Inside, garments sat folded in careful layers or shoved in hurried bundles. A single chest might contain a couple of linen shirts, a wool gown or 2 hose, a cap, maybe one fancy outfit reserved for Sundays or unexpected invitations. Clothes weren't changed daily, they weren't washed weekly. They were lived in. A Tudor outfit had character. Some outfits had too much character. Domestic sounds, a soft, constant hum of life inside a Tudor home. The soundscape was cozy and crowded. Crackling fire, wooden spoons clinking against bowls, low conversation, children whispering or bickering, wind pressing against the shutters, the occasional satisfied sigh from someone who finally found a place to sit. Life was loud in the streets. Inside the home, it softened, and yet, even the quiet moments felt full layers of tiny noises woven together. Homes were small, families were large, and privacy was something you borrowed for a minute and returned immediately. Daily rhythm, predictable but never easy. A Tudor day began at dawn, which arrived sooner than people wanted in winter and later than they wanted in summer. The morning routine included tending the fire, preparing pottage, fetching water, sweeping the floor, making breakfast, and mentally preparing to repeat all of this tomorrow. Work filled most of the hours between sunrise and sunset. No one lounged idly unless they were sick, wealthy, or pretending to be both. Evenings were for family. People gathered around the hearth. Stories were told. Songs were shared. Someone inevitably fell asleep in a chair and denied it loudly. And slowly, gradually, the fire dimmed. People drifted to their beds. The house settled into night. The roof overhead, both shelter and drama. Most Tudor roofs were made of tiles or thatch. Thatch was warm but flammable, which meant households lived in a constant state of not let sparks touch anything important. Roofs leaked. They creaked. They hosted small birds. Occasionally they hosted not so small birds, but they protected families from rain, wind, and the various airborne things that might fall from the neighbor's upper window. A roof wasn't perfect, but it was home. Living close, living together, living always. Tudor families lived tightly physically, socially, emotionally. Your family shared everything: food, space, work, illness, arguments, and the occasional celebratory moment when a good year brought extra grain or a successful sale. Homes weren't places of solitude, they were places of community, of shared survival. And somehow, despite the soot, the creaking beams, the uneven floors, and the constant awareness that the chimney might be plotting against you, these homes felt warm, alive, loved, small beacons of comfort in a city that rarely paused to breathe. Drifting out quietly, letting the hearth go dim as we step back outside, closing the crooked wooden door gently behind us. The soft glow of the hearth remains in your imagination, a little square of warmth against the darkening London streets. Inside, a family settles into bed. The fire sinks to glowing embers. The house breathes its slow, old house rhythm, and the night wraps around everything like a wool cloak, freshly warmed by the hearth. Sleepy, simple, imperfect, and very human. Tudor London might be noisy outside, but in its homes, the night could be surprisingly calm, perfect for drifting off. Whenever you're ready, just whisper, "Hey everyone, welcome back." Settle in, soften your shoulders, and let the calm of the night melt the edge of your thoughts. Tonight, we're still wandering through Tudor London, slowly, quietly, as if we have all the time in the world. Because, in this video, we do. The city isn't rushing anywhere, and neither are we. Let's drift back onto those cramped, uneven streets, where the smell of freshly baked bread had to fight for its life against absolutely everything else. Because we've explored the noise, the markets, the crowds, and the questionable public hygiene, but there's still so much everyday life left to drift through. Tudor London was a world where people woke up tired, worked tired, and went to sleep tired, which honestly makes it a perfect place for a bedtime story. So, let's wander on. We'll ease our way into the quieter corners of the city, or at least what passed for quiet. In Tudor London, silence was extremely rare, almost mythical. People spoke of it the way we speak about unicorns or affordable rent. But if you were determined, and perhaps a little lucky, you could find pockets of something almost peaceful. One such place was early morning along the Thames, before the boatmen started yelling, before the fishmongers arrived with the day's questionable catches, and before the city properly woke. The fog curled low, heavy and pale, sliding across the river like a sleepy cat, and for a moment, London seemed still. Even the gulls sounded half awake, like they were reconsidering their life choices. But then, of course, reality returned, always eager to ruin everyone's calm, because the Thames wasn't just a river. It was also a sewer, a trash pit, a transportation highway, a fishery, a water supply, and occasionally a place to dispose of things one didn't want found. And yet, Londoners loved it, in a way, or at least tolerated it, which in Tudor times was roughly the same thing. People drank Thames water boiled into ale, rinsed clothes in it, bathed in it, fished from it, worked on it, and complained about it at dinner, usually while consuming something that contained more Thames water. It was a very circular lifestyle. Along its banks, you'd see washerwomen slapping linens against wooden boards while muttering about neighbors, husbands, laundry clients, or basically anything that annoyed them. The gossip was as constant as the river's flow, and depending on which source you trust, sometimes just as filthy. A little farther down, boatmen lived their entire lives shouting for fares, rowing passengers, transporting cargo, or occasionally getting into loud arguments about who stole whose customer. The river was loud, alive, and never entirely safe, especially when you remembered that Tudor boats were extremely optimistic constructions. Thin wooden shells operated by men who were frequently tired, occasionally drunk, and always underpaid. A dangerous combination. But despite the risks, traveling by river was often easier than fighting your way through the streets, especially when the streets were full of livestock vendors, refuse, and the occasional parade of nobles blocking everything while trying to look majestic. The river offered at least the illusion of open space, something in tragically short supply. Let S drift away from the water and into the neighborhoods again, where daily routines carried people from sunrise to dusk. In Tudor London, waking up wasn't guided by alarm clocks, but by the simple fact that once the sun rose, the noise level increased dramatically. Someone would start hammering, someone else would be yelling. A rooster somewhere would be enthusiastically performing its one job, and if none of that woke you, the neighbor's infant probably would. For the average Londoner, the first task of the day was breakfast, which was not, unfortunately, a glamorous Tudor feast. Most people started with small beer, yes, even children, because water was not safe in ways we don't need to dwell on at bedtime. Alongside this, they might have a crust of bread, or pottage, or maybe some leftover cold meat if they were particularly lucky. But for many, breakfast was simply the strength to walk to work, and work, in Tudor London, was everywhere. Tradespeople hammered, stitched, mended, cobbled, boiled, baked, tanned, carved, smithed, and generally created an endless background hum of productivity. If you lived next door to a blacksmith, you lived with the constant sound of metal meeting metal. If you lived above a shop, you lived with the smell of whatever they sold, which could be pleasant or horrifying, or both at once. Apprentices were out early, sleep-deprived, and probably regretting several recent life choices. Apprenticeship in Tudor times was less learning a career and more free labor disguised as educational opportunity. The hours were long, the rules strict, and the punishment for breaking those rules was usually something like getting yelled at, having work added to your duties, or being reminded you couldn't marry or leave until your master decided you weren't a hazard to society anymore. Most weren't, but a few. Well, let's just say the bar wasn't always high. As the day warmed, the streets filled again. Vendors rolled out carts with everything imaginable. Pies of extremely debatable content, vegetables that had seen better days, fish that had never seen better days, cooked eels, cheap trinkets, scraps of fabric used, shoes, and occasionally a dog someone swore was purebred, but whose ancestors probably included at least 5 other species. Street food was surprisingly popular. Pies, hot bread rolls, roasted nuts, and little skewers of meat kept people going. The quality ranged from decent to absolutely not, but it was cheap, easy, and didn't require the consumer to admit they had no idea what was actually inside. A common Tudor expression was essentially, "Eat it while it's hot." Before you can question it, by midday, the city was fully alive. Merchants shouted prices, customers haggled, children ran between stalls, dogs wandered around looking for free food, and at least one person, somewhere, was causing a minor scene over something deeply trivial, because drama is a timeless human tradition. In wealthier areas like around Cheapside or the Strand, you'd also see nobles being carried in litters or riding horses through the crowds, doing their absolute best to appear elegant, while a dozen servants tried to keep people from getting too close. Their clothing was bright, elaborate, and wildly impractical. Layers of velvet, silk, gold embroidery, and feathers that had never asked for this kind of employment. The contrast between rich and poor wasn't subtle. You could spot it at 20 paces. or 50 if the noble in question had decided to wear one of those enormous starched ruffs that made their head look like it was sprouting a dinner plate. But for all the glamour, the wealthy had their own set of Tudor problems, mostly medical ones. Perfume was common because baths were rare, makeup contained lead because safe cosmetics were not yet invented, and the fashionable high forehead, achieved by plucking the front of one's hairline, created an effect best described as perpetually surprised. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners just kept working. Evening approached slowly, and with it came a noticeable shift. The streets didn't exactly calm down, but they did grow dimmer, and the tones softened. Torches flickered along main routes. Candles glowed from the windows of taverns and homes. People finished their work and drifted toward familiar routines, the Tudor version of unwinding. For many, that meant the tavern. Taverns in Tudor London were not quiet, refined establishments. They were noisy, smoky, crowded, and full of people seeking cheap ale and cheaper entertainment. Workers drank to dull exhaustion. Sailors drank to celebrate being alive. Apprentices drank because they could. And musicians played the same 3 songs they knew, loudly, with varying degrees of accuracy. Inside, dice games clattered. Arguments sparked, mostly the harmless kind, but not always. Occasionally, someone tried to start a philosophical debate after their 4th drink, which never ended well. People toasted to everything: health, love, misfortune, payday, new shoes, or simply surviving another week in the city. And yet, despite the chaos, taverns were social anchors. News spread there, friendships formed there, courtship started there, sometimes poorly, sometimes accidentally, but always enthusiastically. Outside, night thickened. Only a few lanterns lit the way, and with darkness came the less pleasant side of Tudor London: thieves, troublemakers, intoxicated citizens, and people who really should not have been outside in that condition. Curfew laws technically existed. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent at best. The watchmen tried, bless them, but their equipment usually consisted of a lantern, a staff, and an overwhelming desire for their shift to be over. Their ability to stop crime was limited to politely asking criminals to please not do that. Sometimes it worked. Usually, it didn't. But even with its hazards, nighttime in Tudor London held a strange charm. The noise was softer, the river glowed faintly, houses looked warmer, their windows bright as candles flickered behind wooden shutters. People hurried home with cloaks pulled close, their footsteps echoing on cobblestones, and eventually, quiet did return. Not true silence. London didn't believe in that, but something closer to stillness. You could hear the faint lapping of the Thames, the creak of tavern signs swaying in the wind, a distant dog barking at absolutely nothing, and the soft rustle of straw beds as people settled in. Families shared sleeping spaces, often to many people in too little room, but it was their room, warm, cramped, and familiar. Children drifted off first, curled under coarse blankets, their dreams probably much nicer than their chores would be in the morning. Adults fell asleep in stages, some after talking quietly about the day, some after one too many ales, some with the resigned exhaustion of people who knew tomorrow would look suspiciously like today. But life went on, and for all its discomfort, Tudor London was full of community, routine, and a steady rhythm that its people understood instinctively. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was theirs. Loud, messy, crowded, smelly, lively, and somehow, in its own way, beautiful. We'll drift further into that world in the next part. For now, just relax and let the city dim round you. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle your head on the pillow, ease the tension from your shoulders, and let the soft hum of Tudor London's night carry you along. We've wandered through the daylight hours, the markets, the noise, the commotion, the questionable pies, but now, we're stepping into the quietest world Tudor London has to offer, or rather, the world that pretended to be quiet. Because London at night wasn't peaceful so much as half-conscious, like someone trying to nap while still aware of at least 3 ongoing arguments in the next room. But don't worry, tonight we're just drifting, slowly, quietly, with nowhere urgent to be. Let's wander on. Night in Tudor London arrived unevenly. There were no glowing street lamps illuminating the city like a warm blanket. Instead, darkness seeped in from the edges, settling into alleys, pooling beneath the wooden overhangs of tall, crooked houses, and stretching across narrow lanes until they became little rivers of shadow. A few lanterns hung from taverns or wealthier homes. Some flickered outside shops that stayed open late, but most of the streets surrendered to the night. If you lived in London then, you got used to navigating in near darkness. People swore they could recognize neighbors by the sound of their footsteps, or the jingle of keys, or the way they muttered to themselves when walking home. And perhaps they could. You learn strange skills when lighting is unreliable, and the average night resembles a dim medieval obstacle course. The curfew bell was supposed to mark the moment decent citizens went indoors and stayed there. But much like most Tudor regulations, curfew worked better in theory than in practice. If you needed to fetch water or return late from work, or simply felt like ignoring the law, as many did, you found yourself slipping through the dark with only a memory and a prayer guiding your path. The city's constables and watchmen wandered about with lanterns, but their presence was more symbolic than effective. They weren't exactly trained professionals, more like volunteers who regretted volunteering. Their job description included preventing crime, helping drunk people home, discouraging loitering, and occasionally shouting "Who goes there?" in the vague hope that sounding authoritative might accomplish something. Most nights, they settled for looking alert while wishing deeply for sunrise. Let's drift a little deeper into the kind of everyday nightly sounds you might hear. First, there was the tavern spillover, the loudest phenomenon of Tudor nightlife. When the alehouse closed its doors, the drinkers didn't always interpret that as a suggestion to go home. Many simply relocated outside, where they continued debating topics no one had asked them about, such as who owed whom a penny, which fishmonger was obviously cursed, whether someone's cousin actually saw a ghost near Smithfield Market, and which pie shop sold the least suspicious pies. An argument with no correct answer. You'd hear laughter, shouts, clinking mugs, the clatter of dice, and the occasional duet between two men who absolutely believed they were gifted singers. They weren't, but after enough ale, everyone was encouraging. Across the city in wealthier districts, nighttime sounded different, quieter, but not silent. You'd hear carriages rattling along the main roads, servants calling out to one another, and dogs alerting their households to absolutely nothing of consequence. In noble homes, a handful of windows glowed with candlelight long after midnight as servants finished chores that no one would thank them for. The wealthy liked to imagine that crime didn't reach their streets. Unfortunately, thieves did not share that belief. Houses with impressive doors and heavy iron locks were exactly the houses thieves preferred, not because they were easier, but because they were more profitable. So, while noble families slept in feather beds under embroidered covers, someone outside might be quietly testing shutters with the gentle optimism of a man hoping for an unlocked window. Crime wasn't theatrical, it was mostly practical. Cutpurses, burglars, and pickpockets didn't look like dramatic villains. They looked like tired people making bad career choices. But danger wasn't constant. Much of the night was simply ordinary. If you passed through the city's center at night, you'd find cats perched confidently on roofs, patrolling for rats. You'd hear the creak of wooden signs swaying in the wind. The Thames lapped quietly against boat docks, sounding almost peaceful if you didn't think too hard about what was floating in it. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a couple argued softly about chores. Somewhere else still, someone snored loudly enough to be considered a public disturbance. Life didn't pause at night, it just softened. Inside the average London home, nighttime was its own world. Most families lived in one or two rooms, so they shared sleeping spaces by necessity. Privacy was, in the Tudor mindset, a luxury for people with money, status, or magical abilities. Ordinary Londoners slept shoulder to shoulder, parents, children, apprentices, and sometimes visiting relatives who stayed longer than expected. The air got stuffy quickly. Windows were shut tight for warmth. Fires were banked cautiously enough to keep a room warm, not enough to burn the house down. Mattresses ranged from soft feather beds, rare to straw pallets common to whatever fabric you had and hoped was comfortable, very common. People slept in their shirts or gowns, partly for warmth, partly because clothing was expensive and you didn't want to wash it unnecessarily. Before sleep, families might share whispered conversations. Children asked questions adults were too tired to answer. Someone recited a prayer. Someone else complained softly about aching joints. And then the household sank into quiet, broken only by the occasional snore, sigh, or the soft rustle of straw as someone adjusted position for the 20th time. Not everyone slept easily, of course. Shift workers, bakers, night watchmen, midwives, and tavern staff stayed awake long past dark. Bakers, for example, famously started work around midnight, so the comforting smell of warm bread drifted through certain streets before sunrise, a small welcome mercy in a city not known for pleasant aromas. Midwives moved through the night with brisk determination, summoned by knocks on the door and urgent whispers. They carried linen cloths, herbs, and the kind of steely nerves earned from years of delivering babies in cramped, dim rooms where half the household watched anxiously. Night belonged to people like them, the quiet, steady workers who kept London functioning while everyone else rested. And then, the skies softened. At first, sunrise wasn't a visible glow. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, a faint sense that darkness was thinning. Birds noticed first, they always do. Before the sun showed its face, you'd hear the fluttering, chirping, cooing chaos of birds greeting the day like they'd just invented morning. Roosters crowed too, though not always at the right time. Contrary to reputation, Tudor roosters crowed whenever they felt like it. Dawn, midnight, afternoon, 3 hours too early, or not at all, depending on their mood. Londoners tolerated them because the alternative was not having chickens, and nobody wanted that. Gradually, light trickled through the city like water finding gaps in stone. Homes lit up first, faint candles, then a soft fire, then the edges of windows catching the earliest sun. Outside, the watchmen let out relieved breaths. Their shift was ending. They could go home, warm their feet, and pretend they hadn't spent the entire night wishing they were somewhere else. The city awoke slowly. Mothers stoked cooking fires. Fathers stretched stiff backs. Children blinked awake, already halfway into mischief, and shopkeepers shuffled toward their stalls, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Bakers carried fresh loaves through the streets, the warm scent of bread temporarily overpowering London's usual perfume of smoke, animals, and absolutely unidentifiable substances. People lined up early, hoping to buy loaves before the best ones sold out, a daily ritual that felt almost sacred. Apprentices trudged out of bed with the enthusiasm of young men who knew they had a 14-hour day ahead. Servants began sweeping shop fronts. Fishmongers arrived with the newest catches, or the least spoiled catches, depending on how generous we want to be. And slowly, the noises returned, hammering, chatter, footsteps, the hum of thousands of people living their lives. Tudor London woke up, not with a roar, but with a groan, the sound of a city stretching, yawning, and accepting that another busy, messy, crowded, unforgettable day had arrived. And so the cycle continued. Darkness softened into dawn, dawn swelled into day, and the city returned to itself, loud, bustling, flawed, alive. Life in Tudor London wasn't glamorous, but it was constant, steady, rhythmic, full of small routines that carried its people through hardship, hope, and the ordinary business of surviving. We'll drift even deeper in the next part, into the city's hidden professions, strange street customs, and the quiet resilience of those who lived at the very bottom. Hey everyone, welcome back for the last stretch of our walk through Tudor London. By now, your mind is comfortably wrapped around crooked streets, smoky kitchens, and the faint whiff of ale mixed with river fog. Tonight, we'll drift into the hidden corners of this bustling city, the parts most outsiders never saw, and the quiet lives of the people who made it all work, imperfectly, but somehow, persistently. Settle in, tuck in your legs, and let's wander slowly. The hidden trades and professions. Every city needs people to do things nobody wants to do. Tudor London had them in abundance. chandlers who made candles from tallow, burning their evenings near stinking vats of fat, fingers inevitably slick and slightly greasy, coopers building barrels for ale, fish, and various other liquids that sometimes shouldn't have been liquid at all, leatherworkers handling hides that had been soaked in lime and urine, producing shoes, belts, and gloves, with smells strong enough to mark the neighborhood for days, scriveners, writing letters for the illiterate, often embellishing the truth in ways that made the sender look more important, clever, or competent than they actually were. These were not glamorous professions, but they kept the city alive, and the people who worked them were survivors, resourceful, skilled, and often dangerously patient. Apprentices filled most of the labor, learning trades while earning very little and sleeping in the same rooms as their masters or other apprentices. A young boy might spend 15 hours at work, then another hour studying the theory of his craft, and finally a brief time trying to rest before the next day began. It was grueling, but it produced competent workers, a steady rhythm, and stories whispered to children at night. One day, you too will haul barrels and curse the stubbornness of fish. Street customs and curious habits. Tudor London had its own social code, a mixture of practicality, superstition, and stubborn habit. Gardez-vous was a warning shouted when chamber pots were emptied into the street. Everyone learned to move quickly or accept wet shoes. People carried small sticks, not for self-defense, but for poking at suspicious food, stray animals, or overly enthusiastic strangers. Public disputes often ended with gestures, shouts, or bets rather than fists, though occasionally fists were involved. Celebrations were noisy and long, particularly if royalty was involved, or if someone survived another plague season. Every ritual and habit was rooted in survival. Hygiene was a hopeful approximation. Safety was mostly imagination. Yet people adapted, laughed, complained, argued, and continued living. Even funerals were managed with careful practicality. Crowds gathered, the procession moved slowly, and people speculated quietly about inheritances, debts, and what would happen to the deceased's belongings. Death was common. Life, therefore, was constantly negotiated with care, wit, and occasional grumbling. The poor and the marginalized, not everyone fit neatly into the city's routines. Many lived on the edges, the unemployed, wandering beggars, and people whose misfortune had no convenient explanation. Vagrants slept wherever possible, often in the doorways of shops or under bridges. Begging children scurried through the streets, quick and clever, selling trinkets or begging coins with the precise pitch of urgency that tugged at hearts and purses. The sick stayed home if they could, or were carried by relatives if they couldn't. Treatment was rudimentary, herbs, prayers, and a lot of hope. Life on the margins was constant negotiation. Food was scarce, shelter was uncertain, safety was almost non-existent. But these people contributed to the city in ways that rarely made the history books, moving goods, performing odd jobs, delivering messages, and sometimes saving the day with a quick hand or a clever solution. Even in the hardest conditions, Tudor Londoners had resilience, an ability to survive, adapt, and continue living despite discomfort, disease, and the ever-present risk of fire or theft. Religion and daily rituals. Faith was central to daily life, not always solemn, often practical. People prayed for safety, health, good fortune, and occasionally for someone else to stop being annoying. Church bells dictated rhythms, marking the hours with gentle, rhythmic reminders of both divine presence and municipal authority. Saints were invoked for all manner of problems: childbirth, illness, business deals, missing livestock, or simply surviving another week. Church was a social anchor as much as a spiritual one. Even those who attended reluctantly benefited from the structure, routine, and gossip. And because churches were usually some of the largest buildings in the city, they also provided a sense of shelter, both physical and psychological, from the crowded, noisy, uneven streets outside. Hidden entertainment and escape, evening entertainment, was often modest. People sang, danced, and told stories in homes, taverns, and open courtyards. Children played hoop and stick or simple ball games. Adults told tales of London's history, local legends, and whispered stories about ghosts and unexplained occurrences, always with a slightly sardonic edge. The theatre was rising in popularity. Playhouses like the Theatre and the Curtain drew audiences from all walks of life, though not everyone could afford the privilege. Performances were noisy, crowded, and occasionally smelled faintly of spilled ale, which, as you now know, was normal. Games of chance, bets on animals, and storytelling competitions offered brief respite from daily labor. Even in poverty, people sought moments of joy. Even in discomfort, people laughed quietly, if only to remind themselves they were still alive. The river at night, a gentle reminder of constant life returning to the Thames. We notice it hasn't slept. Even as the city drifts, the river continues, slow and patient. Fishermen pull in nets, watermen ferry a last passenger, and the reflections of windows dance in the current. The river is both lifeline and boundary, witness and participant. It hums quietly, reminding Londoners that time passes, tides rise, and life continues, whether the streets are silent or chaotic, whether homes are warm or cold, whether people are rich or poor. It's a comforting rhythm, a gentle lull, if one chooses to hear it that way. Closing thoughts, the beauty of a lived city. So, here we are at the end of our long, slow wander. Tudor London is messy, crowded, smelly, noisy, and unpredictable. Yet within its chaos is rhythm, within its noise is community, within its darkness is warmth. The city survives because its people do. Laborers, servants, apprentices, fishwives, craftsmen, watchmen, children, tavern keepers, beggars, and nobles alike. Each life interwoven with the next, creating a tapestry that is loud, flawed, and human. Homes are imperfect. Streets are crooked. Sanitation is questionable. But people adapt. They work, love, eat, argue, pray, sing, laugh, and fall asleep at night, just as we do now, centuries later. And in that, there is a kind of beauty, a comfort in knowing that life carries on, day after day, in small victories, shared meals, and whispered stories beside the fire. So, as you settle into your own night, remember the city, its crooked streets, smoky kitchens, bustling markets, and quiet homes. Let the rhythm of life there, slow, imperfect, persistent, carry you gently into sleep. Good night from Tudor London. Rest well, dream softly, and when you wake, know that people have always lived, struggled, and endured in ways messy, human, and quietly remarkable.